1940 witnessed Cage's most transgressive move to date in composing music for the choreography of Sevilla Fort's Bacchanal. He opened the lid of the piano and started inserting all manner of objects in between the strings, muting them in various ways. He called this the prepared piano. Screws, bolts, rubber and felt acted as the preparations. On the practical side, it cleared the stage of instruments, making way for the dance. But for Cage it also meant that, quote, the piano had in fact become a percussion orchestra under the control of a single player. The dance spurred Cage to make his music completely independent of whatever it was supposed to accompany, which would become a signature Cagean trait, and a radical aspect of his future collaboration with Ernest Cunningham. Cage moved in 1942 to New York. And the mid-40s were an important period for him in the development of his music. The Perilous Night, the score of 1944, was a dramatic, emotional piece made at the time when he was separating from his wife, Xenia. And at that piece, he poured all his emotion into that composition. And at that moment, he realised the futility of self-expression in music, since he discovered that the audience failed to grasp anything that he felt his was about, this sort of passionate, heart-wrenching moment. So he decided that it's over. It's kind of obsolete, self-expression in music. Seeking a way out of composing emotionally expressive music, Cage began in 1946 to study Hindu aesthetics. His sonatas and interludes, the magnum opus for the prepared piano, is the result of a watershed change in Cage's approach. Based on 9 permanent emotions of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the sonatas and interludes deployed a universal emotion, thus avoiding self-expression. So they were like, joy, sadness, all these kind of given emotions, so he wasn't putting his own into it. By this time, Cage had become increasingly precise in specifying the preparations for the piano, including the size of the bolts and other items and their distances from the bridge of the piano, as well as the specific Steinway model to which they applied. I can have the next slide. Cage met Marcel Duchamp, as I mentioned, in 1942, as soon as he moved to New York. Now, what's important to mention and remember is probably Duchamp's the key precursor in the chance operation. So Duchamp was the pioneer of chance in art in the 20th century, perceiving the handmade and the unilateral position of the conventional author futile, if not hubristic, in an age of mechanical reproduction and industrial mass production. Duchamp rejected painting to create works of art that would complete themselves in radical ways. Through his use of chance, the authorial role operative in Duchamp's work became the implacable questioning of all conventions. So his 3 standard stoppages, which you have here, unites a critique of traditional drawing, the masterful handmade lines of the draftsman, with an undermining of that hallowed French invention of metric. So he called it his joke on the metre. Understood as a conceptual landmark, Duchamp always spoke about it rather lightly. But now we have reason to think about it otherwise. We don't have to believe everything he says. The chance procedure for this experiment, what he did to create this, was to take 3 metre-long pieces of string and drop them to the ground. So when they fell to the ground, obviously they didn't fall straight. They felt bent, but it was still nonetheless a metre, right? So then he glued it to a piece of Prussian blue canvas, very dark blue, almost black canvas, and then glued them to pieces of glass. And then he had to make a new ruler because he had a new metre, right? A new definition of the metre. It's not a straight metre, but it's still a metre. So this was sort of very witty and a very kind of also anti-institutional, because this was a time when you would go to this place, Cercle, in France, and you could see, oh my God, it's a meter, you know, so there's this reverential seriousness about this grand French invention, so Duchamp had to make a joke out of it. And when he was asked, who's the author of this work, he said, oh, the author is chance. So that was his experiment with the meter. As if continuing the experiment without feeling the need to make a sign work, the image of shadows on the wall in Duchamp's New York studio allowed him to contemplate the fundamentally virtual and conceptual status of the creative act. Élevage de poussière, the dust breeding on the large glass up the top, is a landscape of dust that was allowed to gather on the surface of Duchamp's monumental large glass. He had it in his loft in New York sideways, and so we've got this whole layer of dust. And then he had Man Ray photograph it like a landscape. So that work, big pardon. So it's no accident that he recorded these things and leaned on the medium of photography, rather than giving them to us as objects, right? So that, like scores, the photograph's primary function is to frame time, capture something in time, and render something contingent. So Duchamp sort of doubles the chance with the medium of photography. He actually called the ready-made a rendezvous, an encounter, and then he said it's also a snapshot, right? So he was always, you know, running through different disciplines to evoke what his work was about. So we can have the next slide. In 1949, just as Cage was developing the silences and time structures beyond his prepared piano works, he met a brilliant pianist named David Tudor. For Cage, the so-called silence was never empty. It simply meant the opposite to composed sounds, as he said. Oh, as he said, there is no such thing as an empty space or an empty time. As his studies of East and South Asian philosophy deepened, he learned the terms to express his celebration of all that can happen in this space, not dominated by authorial intentionality. This newly coherent theoretical position was presented at the Artists Club in New York. This is the centre of the headquarters of abstract expressionism. I always find this utterly startling because you have a gay man in 1950 standing up in front of the biggest macho guys of all time and saying, I'm here and I have nothing to say. You know, so we'll hear that from Tom tomorrow. It's the most stunning lecture, but like he picked the scariest audience to do it the first time. In the same year, the composer Christian Wolff gave Cage a newly published copy of the I Ching, Book of Changes. So at this time, Cage was turning his composing towards ways of letting sounds appear freely within the spaces he constructed with his time brackets, while working on a piece called Concerto for Prepared Piano and Chamber Orchestra. He composed all the different musical events that could possibly happen in the final movement of that piece, and all were completely independent of one another. And then he sort of arrived at this breakthrough by arranging them into a square chart. Cage then moved through the 115 measures of time and structure, tossing coins and consulting this Chinese oracle, I Ching. He asked, is there sound here or silence? And if sound, which one of the predefined musical events? So I Ching would answer him and he'd go on to the next. I mean, it's a very laborious process. Took him a long time. So he then copied that sound or that silence into his score and kept going. He followed this simple random process to the end of the movement, and the music appeared as a result. Cage was exhilarated with this work. It sounded like nothing else he'd created or ever heard. It was a fulfillment of the key concept advanced in his lecture on Nothing, about the structure built on silent time. That it is a kind of discipline which, once accepted, in return accepts whatever. So this emboldened Cage to move onto the ambitious music for changes for piano. 45 minutes of difficult piano music that would be his first major work, completely derived from this idea of silence, which I'll explain in a moment. So it was composed using chants throughout, from start to finish, in every dimension of the music: sounds, silences, rhythms, dynamics, densities, tempi. Drawing upon the virtuosity of the pianist David Tudor, Cage used this compositional process to generate a wide variety of musical events, piled up at times in layers. The piece, while coming from the structure of silent time, is also bursting with sound, effusive, bubbling over with energy, at times quiet and delicate, at others ferocious, thundering and sharp. The silence revealed musical continuities that Cage could never have foreseen. These come into being as spontaneously as they suddenly disappear. Taking its title from the I Ching, Book of Changes, it was the beginning of Cage's lifelong use of that oracle of chance operations. Soon thereafter, Cage began attending lectures on Zen Buddhism by D.T. Suzuki at Columbia University, developing the ideas of non-intention through chance and the plenum of silence into a complete theoretical and methodological position. One of the most important origin stories, if you think of psychoanalytic model of the origin story, so for Cage, one of the most important origin stories in the Cagean repertoire is that of his 1951 visit to an anechoic chamber at Harvard University. I'm sure many of you have heard that story. In this putatively silent environment, from which all the echoes are technologically removed, Cage proceeded to